Great. Hi, everyone. I think we're going to get started. So welcome to the second lecture of the fall 2014 session. Generous support for the Lowell Institute allows the aquarium to offer these programs free of charge, and we're very grateful to have their support each season. And a special thank you to the WGBH Forum Network for filming tonight's lecture and making it available afterwards so that you can share it with your friends and family. My name is Janin Evans-Weilant, and I work here at the aquarium. I'm the project supervisor for the National Network on Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation, and I'm filling in for our normal, lovely hostess, Gina Prente. She's on maternity leave right now, so there'll be a different aquarium host every time. And tonight, I have the honor of introducing our two wonderful speakers, Allie Goldstein and Kirsten Howard. They're part of our Ocean Stewardship Spotlight lecture tonight. And this is a very special lecture that we do every season, and it's to highlight the amazing achievements of everyday people that are working to save the ocean and provide the best example of what an ocean steward looks like. Our hope is that you leave the lecture tonight inspired to do more within your homes and communities to help make this planet a better place to live. Allie and Kirsten met in August 2011 when they applied via Craigslist to live in the same house in Ann Arbor, Michigan. 2 years later, they graduated with master's degrees from the University of Michigan's School of Natural Resources and the Environment and set out on a 3-month road trip around the United States to uncover stories of climate resilience, people and places adapting to the impacts of climate change, which they will share with us tonight. The duo traveled from the eroding dunes of the Cape to the sinking bayou of Louisiana, to the burning forests of New Mexico, to the drying cornfields of Iowa, and interviewed natural resource managers, city planners, farmers, foresters, fishers, and even a queen about strategies for climate resilience. They published 33 multimedia stories on their blog, www.adaptationstories.com, and their work was covered in local and national news outlets, including The Atlantic, National Geographic's Water Currents blog, Weather.com, and High Country News. After their road trip concluded in August 2013, Allie joined the carbon team at Forest Trends Ecosystem Marketplace in Washington, D.C., and Kirsten began a NOAA Coastal Management Fellowship in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. They continue to write and speak about local examples of climate resilience. Please welcome Allie and Kirsten.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kirsten. This is Allie. Just to clarify that, thanks for coming tonight. We're going to start with a story for you. And a couple summers ago, Allie and I, as Jan mentioned, were on a road trip, and we found ourselves driving through South Carolina on our way to spend the day with the Queen. Now, I don't know about all of you, but spending the day with the Queen has always been pretty high on my list of life priorities. So as we were driving to St. Helena Island, which is a low-lying coastal barrier island in South Carolina, I was pretty excited. Allie was pretty excited. So we met Queen Quet, who's the queen of the Gullah Geechee people. And if you're not familiar with the Gullah Geechee people, they are descended from slaves who were brought over from the western seaboard of Africa about 400 years ago to grow rice in the low country around South Carolina and in the surrounding areas. And Queen Quet met us that morning in traditional garb that her people wear, and she greeted us with a song in the Gullah language, which is a beautiful English Creole language. And she resides on this island where about 10,000 Gullah Geechee live, and she estimates about 1 million descendants of the Gullah Geechee live in the U.S. today. Now, Allie and I were there to specifically learn from Queen Quet about how she thinks and whether she thinks the Gullah Geechee people are going to be able to deal with some of the impacts they expect to see from climate change. So these are things like sea level rise, intensifying hurricanes, higher temperatures on their very low-lying coastal island in their home. And when we asked her this, if she thought they were prepared, and if she thought they would be able to adapt, she said, well, yes, because you see, the Gullah Geechee are inherently resilient people, and if you think about it for a second, it makes a lot of sense. They've overcome slavery, they've dealt with hurricanes on their island before, they have pushed back against the pressures that are constant, the pressures of cultural erosion from other areas. And she pointed to a couple specific things that they do on St. Helena Island. Here in this picture, she's holding a bag of oyster shell. They have an oyster shell recycling program where they take shells from restaurants and oyster fishermen, and they recycle them and put them back on the oyster reefs to provide more habitat for oysters, which builds up, helping the marsh grow better and helping protect against some of the storm surge and sea level rise that they're starting to see. She also talked about how the Gullah Geechee build away from the water. They go to the water. They don't build on the water. And in behind her, in fact, is Hilton Head Island, which is, you may have heard of it, it's a big built-up resort island in South Carolina. She looked over at Hilton Head and she kind of rolled her eyes and said, they're not doing it very well over there. And she told us about, and showed us actually, her home where her family builds, actually all lives in a circle around a communal garden. All of the sort of Gullah families that live on the island tend to live in these communal formats, actually often on the plantations where their ancestors were once slaves. So they share their food from this garden and have built a very strong community network that supports each other. And from a policy perspective, they recently established a cultural district overlay on St. Helena Island, which prohibits golf courses and resorts and larger development from being built, protecting a lot of their open space and protecting some of that flood protection that open space provides. So Allie and I were excited to meet with the Queen and equally excited when we left because we found what we think is kind of the recipe for resilience. So this day with the Queen was part of a larger project that Janin introduced that we called the Great American Adaptation Road Trip, and Allie's going to tell us a little bit more about it.
So during the summer of 2013, we traveled clockwise around the U.S. over 3 months, and we were looking for examples of how people around the country are adapting to the impacts of climate change. So we're going to tell you a few of those stories tonight. But first, just so we're all on the same page, we're going to talk a little bit about what some of the impacts of climate change are here in the Northeast. So if you pay close attention during this part, we're going to do a little trivia later, and you could win one of these cool T-shirts. So how has the climate already changed in the Northeast? So temperatures have increased 2 degrees Fahrenheit on average since 1985. There have been 10 inches of sea level rise since 1900, so that's a tide gauge right off the coast here in Boston. And we've seen about 10% more precipitation, and more of that is falling in the form of rain rather than snow as temperatures get hotter. So you may have seen some of the impacts on the ground. The picture on the left there is a farm in Vermont after a heavy rainstorm, and then the picture on the right is some coastal erosion on Cape Cod.
So that's the change that we've seen already in the area. What can Boston expect in the future? So this depends a lot on the carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions that we release. There's still some room for variation in terms of what we're going to see, but the estimates of the range of change are getting pretty certain, especially with regard to temperature. So we're going to see between 4.5 and 10 degrees Fahrenheit increase in temperature by 2080. We're also going to see between 1 and 4 more feet of sea level rise by 2100, and probably on the higher range of that spectrum. And today, actually, was a king tide in the Northeast. And if you're not familiar with a king tide, there are a couple of them every year, the highest high tide and actually the lowest low tide of the year. And so tomorrow is a pretty high tide as well. If you take a look around the coastal areas of Boston, you might see around noon that the high tide is quite high, and that gives a little bit of an idea of what we're going to start to see more regularly in the future. Another statistic about temperature, another prediction, is that by 2100 we could see a climate in Boston, in Massachusetts, that looks pretty similar to South Carolina. So that's kind of a striking comparison. We'll see more intense coastal storms, we'll see more precipitation falling in intense bursts, and we'll see more flooding as a result of a lot of those effects.
So a little bit about why we were interested in looking at the idea of adaptation. So we met at the University of Michigan in grad school, where we studied climate policy and science. And as you do in grad school, we spent a lot more time doing more of the picture on the right in front of a computer than out in the world looking at examples. So we wanted to answer the question, what does adaptation look like on the ground? How are people dealing with impacts in communities? And the reason we want to do this is because obviously we should be doing all we can to try and curb carbon dioxide emissions. But even if we stopped all emissions today, somehow took all the cars off the road, switched to all wind and solar energy, we would still see the lower spectrum of those impacts for decades to come. So it's a good idea to start preparing for them, and we wanted to see what that looked like around the U.S. So this is day one of our trip. We packed up my mom's van in my driveway. My parents had a bet as to whether the van would make it all the way around the country, and it did. So, day one.
And as Jan mentioned, we kept a blog along the trip. A major goal, in addition to gaining a better understanding ourselves of what climate adaptation looked like, was to share what we learned with other people. And we decided to do that in a storytelling approach. So we used kind of a multimedia method with photos and some audio and video, and ended up writing a series of stories as we went on the road, which was tough. We had one person driving and one person writing most of the time, but we managed to achieve that. And this is a map of all of the places we went. So we essentially took basically a clockwise route around the country. We drove 17,358 miles, and we're very aware of the fact that there's some irony about telling stories about climate change while we're driving a van around the country and releasing some carbon dioxide as we go. So we offset our emissions. We calculated about 10 tons of CO2 emissions were released over the course of our 3-month trip. The red pins represent places where we wrote stories. The blue pins represent places where we went for fun, since it was a road trip after all. We did 172 interviews, 36 stories ultimately on the blog, and we visited 32 states. And we were very happy that we only had one flat tire.
So one of the first stories that we looked at that we wanted to share with you is here in Boston. So this is the new design for Spalding Hospital, which I think opened a couple years ago. And they looked at some of the tragedy that happened in hospitals after Katrina on the Gulf Coast, and they made some improvements to the design. So a few things of note here is that the most important equipment in the hospital is on the roof instead of on the first floor where it is in a lot of hospitals. So this hospital can actually lose the entire first floor and everything is fine. It'll still be working. The windows, if the power goes out, automatically open from the inside. That was a big problem after Katrina, that patients were essentially locked in their rooms. So that's sort of an automatic stopgap measure. There's also some interesting landscaping around the hospital. So it's right on the water, but there's no direct path that a wave can take from the coast directly to hit the building. So a few things, and we learned yesterday this is the most climate resilient hospital in the world, I think. But that was from the chief of environment of Boston, so maybe biased. But it is pretty cool. So then we started our drive down the East Coast. We knew we had to do a post-Sandy story. So we went to Long Island, New York, and we met with Empower Solar, which is a solar company that got hit extremely hard during the storm. Their office was filled with 3 feet of water. They lost about half of their car and van fleet, and some homes that were under contract to get solar panels installed soon actually burned down. So it was a very tough time for them, but they decided they weren't going to lay off any employees. They were going to stay open through the storm. And what they did was they operated out of employees' homes, and they actually sent the employees around to shut down power systems around Long Island. So when those systems come into contact with salt water, that's what caused a lot of the fires in New Jersey and New York after Sandy. So Empower employees hopefully helped to prevent some of that. And after they got back up and running back in their office about 6 weeks later, something sort of unusual started to happen with the business. So I'm going to actually play a quote from David Sharon, who's the founder of Empower Solar.
To get back. So we got back up and went.
It'll make more sense if we started from the beginning.
One thing I'll mention is that a lot of businesses got hurt much worse. They were either smaller or they just didn't. People just decided to get out of business.
Yeah.
They just left. So, but we were the first business back on the street. Probably took us 6 weeks to get back. So we got back up, and what started to happen quickly. Interest in backup power and solar spiked.
So what you heard David say there at the end was that whereas almost no one was interested in buying a backup battery system for their solar panels before the storm, after spending a week or more without power, more people became interested in having backup. So in 2013, when we visited, they were on track to install a backup battery with about 5% of their systems, which still is not a lot, but it was still sort of an exponential increase from what the interest was before the storm. So that both helps people keep the lights on in the event of the next Hurricane Sandy, and it also gets them off the grid in Long Island, which is mostly fossil fuels. So an interesting example of climate adaptation and mitigation working together.
We went to Baltimore, Maryland, where they're dealing with really hot temperatures, expected to only increase. And in big cities like Baltimore, where there's a lot of pavement, they deal with what's called the urban heat island effect, which means that the city actually absorbs so much heat because of the pavement, it can be up to 50 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the surrounding temperate forest. And as a result, Baltimore has a pretty comprehensive plan to plant more trees, providing more shade in the city, which can ultimately reduce the temperatures by up to around 9 degrees Fahrenheit. We went to Bogue Banks in North Carolina, where they are they're using some innovative shoreline management techniques instead of building seawalls and sort of more hardened structures along their coast, which can really impact the native habitat and resources that exist there. They're building what they call living shorelines. And this is essentially a salt marsh that's being restored and some rock put in front of it to help build up the oyster reef in front of it, which will provide some of that flooding protection that they're going to need with sea level rise and more intense storms. Next, we stopped in Camilla, Georgia, which is a really small town in southwest Georgia. We spent a day with Casey Cox, who's a 21-year-old female corn farmer in the area. She's a rare breed currently. And she's working with some researchers at a nearby research station to pilot some new technology for irrigation systems in the area. So this is a big irrigation system that waters the peanuts and the corn that they grow everywhere. And they use GPS on this system to tell the irrigation spigot, the center pivot, to stop watering in places where they don't need as much water, change the rate of water. By saving that additional water, they're able to buffer some of the impacts they expect to see related to drought. So we reached the end of the earth in Louisiana, and Allie's going to show you what that looks like. Driving down there, the highways just go right to the end of the marsh, and Louisiana is actually sinking while they're also experiencing sea level rise, which means right now they're seeing a football field of land lost every 38 minutes. And that means that these storms and hurricanes that they're seeing are just going to hit New Orleans and other communities harder because they don't have that coastal protection anymore. We drove back up from the end of the world to New Orleans, where what you see in this picture is called an evacuation spot. And this is the place that residents go to catch a bus out of the city in the event of a hurricane evacuation. This is created through a partnership with a nonprofit called Evacueer. They partnered with the New Orleans Art Council and held an art contest to make these really innovative and striking statues to help people understand where they're supposed to go. The artist that won is actually from Boston. And the reason this started was when Katrina hit, you might remember, there was a lot of tragedy because the city actually operated under what they called a vertical evacuation policy, which meant they tried to keep people safe in the city. They put them in the Superdome, and they put them in hotels, and people got stuck in hospitals. So after that, they learned that lesson at least and decided they needed to get people out in the case of a hurricane and do real evacuation. When Hurricane Gustav hit in 2008, they evacuated people, but it didn't work that smoothly. They didn't get as many people out as they wanted to. Part of the reason for that was because the evacuation signs looked like this. Nobody read that. And so Evacueer decided they needed some creative strategies to help make evacuation a little bit more understandable. So they created these statues. There are 17 of them around the city. And in addition to this sort of art evacuation emergency preparedness partnership, they also signed a contract, the Evacueer signed a contract with the City Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness to train 500 volunteers every hurricane season. They target volunteers in their mid-20s who don't have, tend not to have families and are able to give up their time in the event of an emergency. And they teach them things like make sure you keep the families together, encourage people to bring their pets along. These are things that in traditional evacuations tend to be sticking points and reasons why people don't decide they don't want to leave. And we happened to be in New Orleans on the day that they were doing a photo shoot with the artist from Boston and some bus drivers from New Orleans. So we were able to capture some great images of them pretending to be evacuee spots and lines of buses along the side. Fortunate coincidence.
So next we started our trip west, where the climate change impacts look very different than they do along the coast. So we went to the Santa Fe National Forest in New Mexico and met with Bill Armstrong, who's been working for the Forest Service there for 25 years. And he told us some of the impacts of fire on the landscape. So a lot of the Santa Fe National Forest now looks like this, sort of tree skeletons. So there are a few reasons for that. The main one that he talked about was the way the forest has been managed over the last 100 years or so. So when people started to move west, there was basically an attitude that we should put out fires. So as the West has developed, the fires that used to burn about every 7 to 11 years basically stopped in the 1880s. So that leaves the forest with about 900 trees per acre, when before the 1880s there were about 40 trees per acre. So there's like 20 times the number of trees that this landscape would support. So when you layer climate change on top of that, temperatures in the south west are expected to rise about 4 degrees Fahrenheit. There's a lot less snowpack, so it's drier, and the range of the pine beetle is also expanding in the west, so that leaves more dead trees. So fires that would once burn sort of low along the ground and be safe now shoot up into the crowns of the trees and travel extremely fast and burn down homes, occasionally kill people, as you may have heard in the news. So there are a few techniques that we can use to fight this. The main one that Bill Armstrong advocates for is fighting fire with fire, so doing controlled burns over a large number of acres. Often the fire risk in the West is actually too high to actually do controlled burns, so another option is to thin and clean out brush. He's fairly pessimistic about the pace that's happening in the Santa Fe National Forest, and particularly, he says there's way more funding towards putting out fires after they occur and not enough on fire prevention. But we found a little more of a hopeful example in Denver, Colorado, where we found an innovative partnership between the major water utility in Denver and the U.S. Forest Service. So you might wonder why a water utility would be interested in forest management. So I'll show you a few images. This was after the Buffalo Creek fire in 1992. It burned about 12,000 acres outside of Denver. That's the fire scar. So after that happened, when the trees are no longer on the landscape, when it rains, the muck and debris basically washes into the sources of water that provide water for 1.3 million people in Denver and the surrounding areas. So Denver Water spent $3 million cleaning out this particular water source, and they decided that they need to do something upstream in the watersheds. So they actually own about 50,000 acres around the city, and they started to treat those. But then in 2002, the Hayman fire burned about 10 times this area. So they realized that they needed to do more. And the U.S. Forest Service owns most of the forest around the city of Denver, so they came up with a partnership. And what they did is they basically each put up half of the money, and it's a $33 million pot, and the goal is to treat 38,000 acres over 5 years. So this is called the From Forest to Fires Partnership. And it started in 2010, and they're on track to treat those acres by 2015. So the way that Denver is raising their half of the money is sort of interesting. So they're raising rates for all of their ratepayers, but it's only about 14 cents a month. So it's a small amount of money per person that makes a big difference for the quality of water in Denver. And they've actually done a lot of outreach to explain to people why they're seeing an extra 14 cents on their bill and what the issues are. But they said that outreach is not even that necessary. So this is Don Kennedy of Denver Water, who said, the more fires we have, the more people understand the need to manage the land. I think it was obvious that the writing was on the wall.
We stopped in Tucson, Arizona, where we met Brad Lancaster, who is a world-renowned rainwater harvester, and he has all these crazy techniques in his neighborhood to capture the very small amount of rain that they see in their desert climate, which will help to provide more shade and more vegetation and more of a water source in the event of higher temperatures. We camped in Joshua Tree National Park, where we talked to some park rangers about how the tree is having trouble actually reproducing in the higher temperatures that they're seeing, and is actually mostly only in existence at higher elevations now that are a little cooler. We dipped our toes in the Pacific, very exciting. And we stopped in Napa Valley, California, mostly because we wanted to drink some wine, but also because the wineries there are starting to think about what varieties of grapes they might need to grow and what strategies they can use to shape the grapes, as they're also seeing higher temperatures. And then we stopped in the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State, where the oyster farming industry is a big part of the area. We stayed with Hama Hama Oyster Company in their guest house, actually, very nice people. And here you can see the owner holding one of their oysters. And so the reason we were there was because in 2007, there was a huge crash in the oyster industry in Washington State, and nobody really knew why. What they knew was that the hatcheries, where the farmers get most of their seed, which they spread out on their farms to help grow the oysters, the hatcheries saw a complete die-off of all of the oyster larvae in their tanks. And it took Benoit Udeline, who gave us a tour of the Taylor Shellfish Hatchery, remembered this as a very trying time because they just had no idea what was going on. So it took some researchers at Oregon State University to figure out that a big reason why they had this die-off was ocean acidification. And you may have heard something about ocean acidification, but the oceans are absorbing between 1/3 and 50% of all of the carbon dioxide that we emit into the atmosphere. And what this means is not only that the oceans are getting warmer, but also that they're acidifying, they're becoming more acidic, which means that when they take the water from the ocean into these tanks to help grow the larvae aren't able to access the calcium carbonate from the water that they normally need to grow their shell, which makes them very weak and they're not able to survive, and then they all died in this particular year. And so once they figured this out, they came up with some stopgap kind of short-term measures. The industry banded together with some scientists and they got the federal government to give $500,000 for monitoring equipment. So on the left you can see the real-time monitoring equipment at the Taylor Shellfish Hatchery. It tells them what the pH of the water is that they're taking in for their hatchery. It tells them some stuff about CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. And on the right, you can see a bucket of what's called sodium carbonate, which is actually artificially inserted into the water that they use in the tanks to buffer the solution and allow the larvae to access that calcium carbonate that they normally need. So that's a pretty clear adaptation, very short-term solution. One thing that Bill Dewey, who also works for the Taylor Shellfish Company, told us was, in hindsight, it was kind of stupid of us. We had this multi-million-dollar investment, and we weren't even keeping track of what's going on in the water. And he likened it to turning the headlights on in the middle of the dark. They figured out what this issue was. But as I said, short term, the oceans are expected to acidify by up to 150% of what we've seen historically. And so that means that there could be some real impacts for the adult oysters that are a little bit more resilient currently. And so they've been able to get from the state $1.8 million for a new research institute, an ocean acidification research center at the University of Washington. And this partnership between the industry and the scientists is ongoing. They're coming up with policy recommendations as well, and really trying to focus on that local data to try and think about what they can do in the coming change.
So next we went to Glacier National Park in Montana, which is quickly losing its namesake. When the park was founded in the early 1900s, there were 150 glaciers. There are 25 left. So this is us sitting on a rock in front of one of the last ones. So unless we make it back in the next 15 years or so, you probably won't see a picture like this again. So we talked to some of the people in the park about how they were thinking about how the ecosystems in the park would or could adapt to a park without glaciers and without a lot of the snowpack that drives the ecosystems in the park, and also about how they were going to talk to people who visited the park about why the glaciers were gone, which was an interesting piece. So then we went to the Corn Belt, Iowa and Nebraska, to think about this big question of how climate change is going to affect our food system. So we met with two of the biggest seed companies in the world, Monsanto and DuPont, who are developing high-tech seeds to deal with impacts of drought. So you may remember in the news, 2012 was one of the worst droughts, or the worst drought the Corn Belt has seen since the 1930s. And corn yields have basically gone up every year since the 1950s, except in 2012 when they dropped. So those droughts are expected to become longer and more severe in the future as temperatures rise. So Monsanto and DuPont have two slightly different techniques that they're using to develop these high-tech seeds. So DuPont has a robot, which is the only one in the world, so we weren't allowed to photograph it. But it essentially selects corn genotypes that can grow on very low water. And then those seeds are tested in the field. So they field tested over 10,000 varieties of corn. This line of corn is actually about 50 years in the making. So the best seed has about 10% higher yields than the next best in drought conditions. Monsanto is using transgenes, otherwise known as genetically modified organisms, which we had heard a lot of controversy about. We didn't really have a good understanding of what they were, so we thought we would go straight to the source and ask. So what this particular seed, it's called Drought Guard. It was actually, it was many years in the making, but it was actually released in 2012 in coincidence with the major drought. So it uses a gene from a bacteria. It's a common bacteria that's all around us. But it essentially turns off the mechanism that would encourage the corn to shut down and conserve energy and not grow in low water conditions. So it continues to grow even in drought conditions. So the definition of a GMO is essentially an organism that's not corn that's inserted into corn. So that's what it was. And this corn can grow on about a ½ inch water less than the next best seed. So this is Chandler Mazur of Monsanto, who says a ½ inch of water doesn't sound like a whole lot, but to a dryland farmer, a lot of times that's the difference between a crop and no crop. So we did talk to a real live farmer about what he thought about all of this. This is David Seek, who's on the board of the Iowa Corn Growers Association, which, as you can imagine, is like the most powerful industry group in Iowa. And he thinks that seeds are just one part of the equation of how farmers should be dealing with drought. So he cares a lot about the soil and uses cover crops and practices no-till farming as some other techniques. But he also does use the high-tech seeds. And he essentially says that farmers need every tool in the toolkit that they can get, and he encouraged us to come up with a better solution. So
we stopped briefly in Chicago, Illinois, where we snuck up onto the roof of a high school because it was painted white. In Chicago, they're also dealing with heat issues and the urban heat island effect that I talked about earlier. Most flat roofs in cities are painted dark colors, which absorb a lot of heat and make the surrounding areas hotter. So Chicago's painting a lot of their roofs white, and the idea behind this is that it reflects a lot of the light and keeps the building cooler and the surrounding area cooler, which can help them deal with some of those hotter temperatures. And then we stopped in Ann Arbor, which was our hometown and point of origin. Ann Arbor is a great little city, and unfortunately over the last few summers has been dealing with a lot of really extreme rain events. A lot of big floods have arisen as a result. They've actually seen a 25% increase in precipitation over the last 30 years. And so that's the major impact that they're expecting to see in addition to temperatures rising. What you see here is Mary Beth Doyle Park, which is a constructed wetland park in Ann Arbor. It's designed specifically in an area that's very flood prone, and it protects some of the nearby homes because it absorbs about 15 million gallons of water in the event of a big rainstorm. And when it's not flooded, it has some great wildlife habitat, lots of really cool birds. So the way that Ann Arbor funded this park is really interesting. Ann Arbor has what's called a stormwater utility, and I think there are 3 in Massachusetts. I know there are none in New Hampshire. There are a few in the Midwest, about 400 in the country, and what it is basically the city charges people a fee for the amount of impervious surface that they have on their property. And impervious surface doesn't absorb this rainwater, which means that it sends what's called stormwater off into the city pipes and puts kind of a drag on their infrastructure. So you're paying for the services of that stormwater infrastructure. What you see here is our home in Ann Arbor. You can go on the city's website and look at this infrared map. They did a flyover with the University of Michigan to map all of the impervious surface. So you can go and test out and see if they have the impervious cover right, and you can put in sort of a complaint or an appeal and get a change in fees if they're incorrect. You can also add rain barrels and add rain gardens and other strategies to reduce your fee, which is a neat service. But the city makes $15 million a year on this, and they're able to pay for floodplain management projects like that park. This is pretty new pervious pavement that has kind of larger holes between the particles, which allow the rain to infiltrate down into the groundwater in the event of a big rainstorm. And one thing that Matt Nod, the environmental coordinator in Ann Arbor, told us is that they don't do anything for just one reason anymore. This is a great example of how projects like this that actually get off the ground have multiple benefits, and the way that you talk about them and framing them as in the form that they have multiple benefits is really important to get that support for them. So aesthetics provided by parks, additional revenue for the city, stormwater management, floodplain management, all of these things come about from the stormwater utility. And that helped them get it off the ground.
So by the end of the trip, we were able to answer the question, what does adaptation look like, in at least 36 ways, I think. So we hope we've given you some idea of that. Some of the major takeaways from the trip were that people's love for the place they live is often why they take action. That was sort of a common denominator in places we went across the U.S. We found lots of examples of communities that were able to cut carbon dioxide emissions through a project that also increases their resilience to climate impacts. We saw lots of interesting partnerships between the public and private sector, nonprofits, individuals, all sorts of people that didn't ever expect to be working together that were. We saw some innovative financing mechanisms, Ann Arbor being one example. We saw people using downscaled climate science, so often looking at global projections for something like sea level rise, it's hard to know how that applies to you and your community. So people are taking some of the big science and scaling it down so it can be actually useful for decision making at a local planning level. There are many co-benefits of these actions. We found very few examples of people who said, I'm doing this project to adapt to climate change. There was often a lot of other reasons why these actions were happening. So often adaptation itself was a co-benefit of other things. We met really a lot of amazing people over the summer. One man in Kentucky who comes to mind, he was concerned about the urban heat island in his neighborhood and facilitated the planting of over 17,000 trees. So it's examples of people like that who pretty much single-handedly are able to bring people together and create a change at the local level that inspired us. And we also found that, so we had a hunch, obviously, before we started a storytelling trip that stories would be a powerful way to connect and communicate with people. And we found that that was even more true than we could have imagined.
So we'll leave you with one quote from Queen Quet that resonated very deeply with us. She said, "In the other world, there's this word called adaptation. There's this word called resiliency. Those words don't exist in the Gullah language. We call it living."
Hold on just a little while longer. Hold on just a little while longer. Hold on just a little while longer. Everything gonna be alright.
So thank you all very much for spending your evening with us. We're happy to take some questions from you, and like Allie said, we have some t-shirts to give away too, so we're going to ask you a couple of questions. But just to start, does anybody have a question for us about the trip? Yes.
I have a question. I'm wondering if, in addition to visiting Monsanto, if you spent time perhaps with any farmers that are practicing agroecology and building up their soil and helping to sequester carbon. I don't know how many in the room have experience with agriculture, but the use of fertilizer dramatically prevents sequestration in soil. So it's while there's much talk about reducing emissions, there are many farmers and agriculturalists that are now going beyond that and actually having a net negative carbon impact. And I'm wondering whether you had the opportunity to speak with folks like that.
So in case you didn't hear it, the gentleman
I
asked.
came in late, I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries. Asked if we saw any farmers who were using strategies to preserve the carbon in their soil. And I can think
No, that's not true. Not only preserve it, but...
I'll give it to you.
Oh, okay. Conventional agricultural methods deplete the carbon life in the soil, which is why so much fertilizer has to be used every year on a year-to-year basis, because the soil is essentially dead. What I'm wondering is whether you had the opportunity to meet with farmers who are not only maintaining the carbon in the soil, but in fact using any number of methods, some of which you alluded to earlier with the no-till, for example, pasture cropping. If you had an opportunity to speak with folks who are building up the soil carbon and thereby pulling carbon out of the atmosphere as a climate mitigation strategy.
So we did meet with other farmers. We met with some fruit farmers in Colorado, a couple in Vermont who farms on the hilltop and grows mostly vegetables. So farmers at all scales. We didn't talk about soil carbon in particular, but I mean in Iowa that is the form of farming that most people do, so that was why we did that story there. I think there are other ways to farm, and we saw examples of that around the U.S. But as they told us in Iowa, corn is king. Unless you make a very concerted effort, most meals that you eat are filled with corn. So it's in the food system that we currently have, these drought seeds are important. It seems, at least to those farmers. So yeah, it's a very sticky problem. So essentially, those farmers or those seed companies are working on resilience within the food system that exists. We're not necessarily advocating for that food system, but it's sort of the reality at the moment.
Yes.
Hi, I'm wondering if you can elaborate on some of the methods that the man in Phoenix was using about rainwater capture.
Sure. So she asked for some elaboration on the rainwater harvesting story in Tucson, Arizona. Brad Lancaster has written a couple books about strategies for rainwater harvesting. If you're really into it, you should look him up. But he pioneered, well, in his particular neighborhood, he pioneered the curb cut method, where they actually did it illegally. They went out in the middle of the night and cut basically a slot in the curb on their street, which allowed, especially in the rainy season when they got a lot of intense rainstorms, allowed the water to go off of the street into a tree well nearby, and he has some really beautiful trees growing that he feeds primarily with these curb cuts. And now after that, after they did it illegally, they went to the city and said, look, this is a great idea, you should make this legal. And now there's like a $40 permit and a lot of construction companies in the area that know how to make these curb cuts, and his entire street has them now. So that's one really tangible way. He also, he has his washing machine fed by rainwater and an outdoor shower, and he gets his drinking water from rainwater. He siphons it through various sort of sediment particles to make it clean enough to drink. So he's pretty extreme on the spectrum of rainwater harvesting, and some really great examples from him. Yes.
You said that there are three stormwater utilities in Boston. Can you elaborate? I've never heard of that.
So she asked about the 3 stormwater utilities in Massachusetts. You're really testing me on that. Chicopee, I think, is a town in Massachusetts. They're the first, and they're the one that's best known. So look them up. I think they're written up in a bunch of case studies. And then a couple others that I can't remember off the top of my head have fairly recently adopted a stormwater utility. I know some communities in New Hampshire are thinking about it, but they're just not quite there yet. So it's becoming a little bit more well-known in the area. Chicopee is the best example, I think, locally.
If no one asks questions, we're going to ask you questions. So, yeah.
Actually, may I? I just had a quick comment that I would like to make, if I may. I work with a nonprofit group called Biodiversity for a Livable Climate. We're working with faculty at Tufts University. Tufts is hosting a conference in November on reversing global warming by using some of these agroecology methods that I mentioned. As a climate activist for many years, one of the things that I found frustrating is that many people think the solution is in cutting emissions. And while that's crucial, it is not sufficient. Even if we cut all carbon emissions tomorrow, the world will continue heating for centuries or millennia, as those of you who have studied climate science already know. The question has been, is there any way to get this excess carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere? Richard Branson from Virgin Airlines had his contest, the Virgin Earth Challenge, which identified 11 methods that they feel offer the most hope for getting the excess carbon out of the atmosphere. So if any of you are interested in this conference, I'd be more than happy to share. I have a flyer I'd be happy to give you on your way out. Thank you.
Thanks. Yes.
Do you have any sense for which of any of these strategies were particularly politically difficult to get enacted, and how sort of these planners got over those political hurdles, or did people mention other things they would like to be doing and they just couldn't get a community to agree with?
Yeah, so she asked about some political hurdles. I can think of a couple.
Yeah.
I'll go first.
Well, I think the way that we got around it and how planners are getting around it is simply the language that you use. So we met with one nonprofit in Texas that says we can't get funding for doing this coastal restoration project if we call it climate change. But we can do the exact same thing and just not use those words in our proposal. So we did see examples of that, and often when you talk about the impact itself, it makes a lot more sense to people. So when we went to ask people questions, we didn't say, how are you adapting to climate change? I don't think anyone, unless they're in the field, knows the answer to that question. We say, how are you dealing with the floods that have increased over the last 10 years? So that's one way.
Yeah, I think that's the main one that comes to mind. We also went to North Carolina, where I'm sure many of you have heard of some of the political hurdles they're dealing with there. Stephen Colbert did a whole spot on how they're banning sea level rise. So there, we talked to the Coastal Zone Management Office, and they're actually a really great pioneer of these living shorelines. You saw the Bogue Banks example. And again, they're just not really calling it climate change. They're promoting these strategies at the community level and kind of circumventing the really sort of politicized conversation that's happening at the state level. That's another example. Should we ask a question of the crowd? Yeah. Okay. So this is to win one of these great T-shirts. I think we have all sizes, so no excuses. Who can tell us the projections for sea level rise in the Northeast for 2100? In the pink shirt back there. Very good. She said between 1 to 4 feet. All right, you can come down and grab your T-shirt after the fact. We'll keep one for you. I wish I had one of those T-shirt guns that they use at the sports stadiums. Does anyone have another question for us about the trip? Yes, Eric.
I'm curious if, since we're at an aquarium, if you could talk a little bit more about how the shells were not forming on the oysters and what that means for overall ocean health. And if you know, did you ever find out if there's what is the rate of ocean acidification where we would actually see something really big happen?
Okay, so he asked about ocean acidification and why the oyster larvae aren't able to make their shells, and whether there's sort of a tipping point or in terms of the point where we'd see something really big, what the rate of acidification is. I don't know the rate of acidification. I do know that the mechanism behind the larvae not being able to form their shell is that they need to extract this calcium carbonate out of the water, and there's an equation a chemical equation that I haven't memorized that shows you exactly why the extra H protons are taking the calcium carbonate. They're bonding with that carbonate and making it not bioavailable for the larva. So at that critical point, when they're born, they're little swimmers and they don't have any shells, and they have a few day period where they need to just survive on what the energy that was in the original egg, and if they're not able to, if they have to use additional energy to create that shell because they can't access so much of that calcium carbonate, they have to work that much harder, and then they become weak and die. In terms of the rate of acidification, I actually think they don't really know very well. It seems like they're pretty uncertain about both how much of it is due to carbon dioxide emissions and how much of it is due to dissolved oxygen, which is a whole other problem in a lot of our polluted water bodies. But I think they thought it was about half and half, and in terms of the rate, I don't think they can tell you. Hopefully that institute they're building at the University of Washington will help figure that out.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the scary thing for the oyster industry is they don't know where the tipping point is, so they can change the pH in small tanks of water, but they can't do it in the entire ocean, and they can't grow oysters in tanks. So once the pH gets so high that it's affecting the oysters at a later stage in life, they're sort of at a loss of what they're going to do at that point.
Yes. One more?
Yeah. Did you do something to offset the carbon from your trip?
Yeah.
Some way, what you look at as alternatives to doing the offset and what you decided that?
Yeah, great question. She asked about offsetting. You take it. Allie works on carbon offsets full time, so she's definitely more qualified.
Yeah, so there's actually few opportunities for individuals to buy carbon offsets. It's mostly something that companies do. So we wanted, and we also wanted to support projects in the U.S. So we used TerraPass, which does sell offsets to individuals. So they go to methane reduction projects, mostly in agriculture in the U.S. Yeah, I think that's it. And we used an EPA calculator, so we included the emissions from the vehicle and also what we used in buildings. We actually thought about trying to take like an electric car or something, but it was just a cost thing. We couldn't buy a new car for the trip, so this is what we had.
Yeah, we hope that in 20 years, when we decide to do this again with our families, there will be like, great enough public transportation to be able to do this without having to take a car or, hovercrafts that don't release any emissions. So, fingers crossed. I'm sure there's some young folks in the audience who can help develop that.
So I think this is a great project that you guys did. It really humanizes, climate change and tells stories. And so my question to you then is, what is the genesis of this project? I mean, you guys obviously met, but then how did some of the logistics of finding these interesting people and these interesting stories throughout the country, and then cramming that into 3 months?
We made sure we slept just enough to be able to stay awake while we drove, so our parents didn't get scared. We also we came up with the idea, I think, the summer before in 2012, and we wrote a little proposal and decided we would shop it around to see if anyone would be able to fund it. We came very randomly across an anonymous donor out in Silicon Valley in California. We have no idea who they are, but they sent us a check because they were very interested in scientific storytelling. So that was very fortunate. And in addition to that, the University of Michigan funded a fair amount of the trip. And we did a Kickstarter as well. So we had friends and family, some of whom are in the audience, donate $10 and we sent them a postcard. And in terms of sort of the logistics, Allie could probably speak to that.
Yeah, so how we found the stories, right? We did a lot of research before. We had a spreadsheet of possible stories of adaptation around the country. So I would say we had some like iconic places that we wanted to go, like Glacier National Park, where the impacts of climate change are sort of well known. So about a third of the stories we had in mind in advance, probably about a third of them we found on the way, and there were some sort of happenstance things that happened as well. So we would usually arrange interviews a week in advance. Sometimes we would find a new person we wanted to talk to the day of, and we would just call them up and say, we drove 17,000 miles to talk to you. So people usually make time in their schedule.
It was intense. It was not your average fun summer road trip. It was definitely a lot of work. So don't underestimate that. So maybe one last T-shirt question. Can someone tell me something that they are going to do, or maybe did today, that will help to solve or help us at least deal in some small way with the challenge of climate change? Hand went right up in the back. Yes, sir. A bunch of rain barrels installed around your home. Fantastic.
Awesome.
Great solution. All right.
Well, we want to make sure we thank the ladies. So thank you again to Kirsten and Allie for coming, and thank you to all of you. We hope to see you soon at another lecture in the future. And again, they're every Thursday here for free at 7 o'clock. And outside we have some light fresh refreshments to enjoy. So thanks for coming, and you'll be able to ask the ladies more questions. Thanks.